Champaign County Agriculture Today with your host, Dennis Riggs.
Hello and welcome to Champaign County Agriculture Today. I'm your host Dennis Riggs, and thank you for tuning in. We're back today to talk about this industry called agriculture. Now, it's kind of an interesting industry. Many of you may not know that much about it, but we're going to help you learn about the history of what puts food on your table 3 times a day today in our program. To do that, we have a special guest that's come up from the southern part of Illinois, if you can call Eastern Illinois University southern part. Deborah Reed is a professor at Eastern and also an adjunct professor here at the University of Illinois. Deborah, you teach some classes at those universities. Tell me a little bit about what you teach to our young folks in agriculture.
Well, at U of I teach a course in the history of agriculture in Illinois since 1860. And so we spend a lot of time talking about the social and cultural aspects of agriculture, but also policy and the local, state, and national policy and organizations that affect agriculture.
That makes agriculture is so different from a lot of businesses. Sometimes I talk about how there's a chamber of commerce that represents businesses in town, yet what makes agriculture different being in rural areas? How are they represented?
Well, there have always been local organizations that supported farmers, or better phrase, that farmers have always created organizations that help themselves. And sometimes they were specific to farmers. They were farmers' institutes that were operated at the local and county level and then supported by a state Department of Agriculture or a state institute for farmers of course in Springfield. But there were also a lot of organizations that emerged out of churches and benevolent societies, insurance organizations that helped farmers.
Let's bring folks up to date. East Central Illinois or Illinois agriculture had its beginnings where? It wasn't with the settlers. It was actually before then. Who started agriculture in this area?
Well, Indians were the first farmers, and they tended in this region to be sedentary villages with fields that they moved around so that they could maintain fertility. They harvested corn, beans, squash. They cached their corn in holes in the ground so that they could be assured that they'd have something to consume all winter long. And they were stewards of their land in their way.
And they raised crops not for trade, but rather for subsistence.
Yes. Well, yeah, anthropologists might know of trade networks, and there were certainly trade networks among Indian groups that spanned large areas, but predominantly the food was for local consumption. It was too problematic to transport any distance.
They were livestock producers as well?
Not hunters.
Okay.
As far as I know, and here you're out of my league again, domesticated stock, I do not believe Indians.
Other than the horses, of course.
Well, but now we're talking about different areas, different nations.
Okay. Well, you know what? Let's get out of that area and go to the area that brings us up to where we are today, and that is our modern farmers. It started in this area in about what year? What time did the settlers come in and begin production agriculture?
Well, that's a good question. Well, by county formation, there would have been farmers here. It's difficult to form a county without an established population. So yeah, preceding 1833, you had farmers that were beginning to improve the land, usually looking at the river bottoms and the waterways, woodlands and prairies, places that had already proven themselves to be fertile under Indian cultivation. And that was the initial focus. But eventually, folk began to develop new technology to take advantage of other parts of the state and the county, so to drain swamps and to plow the prairies, make them tillable.
It's hard to realize when you work in East Central Illinois today and see the network of township roads, state roads, federal highways, railroad systems. It's hard to imagine tilling the land and producing a product before any of that was here. What were the challenges then?
Well, Indian trails became the basis for a lot of early roadways. And then railroads, of course, I'm not a railroad historian, but in terms of where they went between places in the most direct route. By the 1840s, when Chicago's being developed, topography played a huge role in where those arms from the city to the country and how the country could get to the city developed. And in terms of a lot of the local farm-to-market roads, it's township and range. I mean, you've got your, along township and range lines. So, and that provided access to most of the people who are buying land in sections, quarter sections, half sections.
I liked how people did things because that was just the best way to do it. There was not really, it wasn't based on straight lines or whatever. It was based on a ridge because that didn't flood out, or it was based on crossing the river here because this was the narrowest point in the river. Very, very interesting stuff. Let's take a look at some early history, early agriculture in Champaign County. We're going to go to slide number 5. And slide number 5, we're going to take a look at a combine. Right there it is.
Yes.
You don't see a diesel smokestack. You don't see, well, it's actually not a combine. It's not. It's a reaper. That's true.
Well, but
Tell us what we're looking at here.
they could easily call them combines, and that they process the grain. But yeah, this horse-drawn, typically horse-drawn because horses moved at the pace that the machine needed to move to do its job. This was a self-raking reaper, so it cut the grain, bound the grain, and tossed off a sheaf.
I've got to get a plug in here for some of the clubs in the area, like the I Tractor Club up here in northern Champaign County, that have equipment like that and put it into use during their exhibitions in the summertime. There's nothing more exciting than to watch that old equipment out there. Well, there's probably a few things more exciting, but it's a lot of fun.
Not for the folks who invest huge amounts of money and much creative energy in this. In Penfield is the Illinois Indiana Antique Tractor
That's the one.
Club. Yeah, you can go and see automated equipment like this, from the earliest reapers, the earliest tractors, all the way up to some of the first combine, the first removable head from the John Deere combine, which I think is 1954.
I think you're about right. That's correct. What's interesting for everybody, whether you're a farmer or not, is to see that early equipment that was probably designed by a farmer and built by a farmer, or at least the concept was. And we hear many of the farm equipment manufacturers were actually farmers that built it for their own purposes.
Practical need, right. And those little machinery companies existed all over in towns like Urbana, Champaign. There would have been, I don't know any, I couldn't spout off a name, but there were undoubtedly companies like that. There were hundreds all over Illinois. We think of McCormick as being the only person who could build a reaper like this. No, there were 200, I think, manufacturers of reapers in the 1870s in Illinois alone.
And each one of them had their own separate little idea. Was it a tricycle front end? Was it a single-wheeled front end? It was just absolutely interesting. I encourage people, there's books like this. I found this one in my library at home. This is a directory of farmers in Champaign County. I looked up my grandpa, Henry Moore, in here, and in there it shows that back in 1917 he had a tractor, and I have to look at it again. I didn't even recognize the name of it. Herdig, or I don't remember, and I went on the web and found a picture of it.
Yes.
Pretty primitive, but helped replace some horsepower.
Yes. Oh, and competition, they would have those farmers' institutes I keep talking about. The representatives from the manufacturers would come and they'd have demonstrations, and there's great photos of the farmers out there very, speculating and skeptical of what this machine could really do for them. And the very interesting thing is that the U of I, this land grant that professed to help train farmers to do better, were definitely not supportive of the tractor. There was a lot of energy placed in helping farmers create more draft power with their horses. They had hitching classes. They produced booklets about how to generate more energy by more effectively hitching a team. Because of the culture of agriculture, if you begin to replace your horses, you change the types of crops you produce, you change the capacity to manure your fields. It required a serious culture shift if you replace the horse with the tractor. And the land grant was not what you would expect an advocate for tractors.
But slowly they came along.
Slowly but surely, yes.
Well, let's talk more about the development of Champaign County. Let's go to slide number 6, and this is showing a small town here in East Central Illinois. I believe it's Sedoris. We got to do a little bit of checking there. Looks like the business district.
Well, the business district, a storefront with the name emblazoned there, just so everyone could know. These small towns were the heart and soul of rural culture. We don't see the churches and the schools, but they were undoubtedly there. And it was the locus. So, you know, you can reasonably get to a town, I mean, I don't know how fast a horse could go, reasonably speaking, but in order to secure the things that you need and to sell the things that you have, you need that small community. And these small communities dotted the landscape. As you begin to see different kinds of transportation systems develop, these small towns cease to exist. And when the small town ceases to exist, there goes the school. And when the school is gone, there goes the community.
I live in southern Champaign County, and just around me, there are about 4 little towns that no longer exist, basically. And the competition was great back then for those towns. Each one wanted a dry goods store, each one wanted a hardware store, and maybe an elevator or a livery stable. But as the transportation got better, those towns couldn't survive on just the local community, and we see that even happening today, don't we?
Right. Oh, very much so. Just in the, I think, a dramatic example are rural hospitals. Aside rural schools but rural hospitals have a horrible time maintaining themselves because they're too expensive for, the small population, diminishing population to maintain, and services go elsewhere.
What we're going to do when we come back, we're going to take a short break right now, but let's talk about, we've got no picture of farmers taking their grain to market. So when we come back in just a few seconds, we're going to talk about how farmers got their grain to market in these small towns. We'll be right back.
At the time of construction in 1945, the University of Illinois Airport, later renamed Willard Airport, was the largest university airport in the world.
Welcome back to Champaign County Agriculture Today. I'm Dennis Riggs. Thanks for tuning in as we talk about the history of agriculture and the history of small towns and farm organizations here in East Central Illinois. Deborah Reed is with us today, and we're talking about all this great history, and I want to talk about how farmers got their grain to market. We're going to go to slide number 7 here, and what we see is a farmer hauling into the elevator.
Yes, near Rising.
Rising elevator out there, still there today.
This, I don't know a lot about the history of this. It may have been a cooperative development. The cooperative movement's very strong movement that came out of populist, Farmers Alliance movements and populism in the late 19th century. So by the early 20th century, little elevators like this, well, they're not so little. They're quite large, in fact, served communities of farmers within a radius of maybe 5 miles. And you could get your grain to that particular elevator, which happened to be built on a particular rail line, and would, go directly to Chicago.
So that was the common denominator for most of these elevators. Very few of them were built without a rail line close by?
Yes, very few of them, if any. I mean, a lot of folks invested in a private rail line. So if they had an elevator that was off of a main track, they'd then have a little private rail line that would transport the grains to the main track, and then from there get access to the cities.
Matter of fact, there's an interesting story in southern Champaign County, a little town by the name of Longview, that actually was moved a mile because the railroad came through and missed the town. So they moved down, built the elevator, built the new downtown. I don't know what year that happened, but the town moved to meet the railroad.
Yeah. Yes, as you drive around the area, if you see an elevator that's not by a rail line, it's often because the rail line moved or it no longer ceased to exist. And then, of course, today with tractor trailers, your new elevators can be wherever the road is. It's just interesting, footprints on the landscape that agriculture leaves behind.
All done for a reason. Another reason that farmers had to organize was the assertion of knowledge and to share ideas and learn how to do things better. Tell me about how farmers began to organize and create organizations.
Well, farmers sought knowledge they didn't always want to be delivered knowledge. So a lot of them wanted to create their own organization so that they could determine, what they wanted to learn and who would teach them. So there were these farmers' institutes that I mentioned existed among progressive farmers. So folks that had some investment money and knew that they could improve their breeds and their seeds often took that route. One of the other major organizations that developed was, of course, the Farm Bureau. And depending upon who's credited with forming the Farm Bureau, farmers believed that they had influence over the Farm Bureau. And when they began to be developed, they were the farmers' organization, as opposed to the Agricultural Extension Service, for example, which was something that was sort of believed to be imposed, supported by the national government, implemented by the state governments, and presented by the land grants. So there's this interesting tension that existed early on between the Farm Bureau and land grant, and particularly Extension Services.
Almost a competition.
Definitely a competition. You also have a competition between different universities. The ones that teach teachers, they want to be the ones that are going to train the teachers of agriculture, so the vocational technology teachers. And there was a competition between U of I and Illinois State over who would be the ones, designated to train the teachers of agriculture in the high schools. So this is all the really, to me, dynamic history of who possesses information and who can transfer that information. But farmers also organized for political reasons. I mean, they had their political preferences. Democrat, Republican aside, they had policy goals. And they wanted to be able to influence that policy. And this comes to a head during the post-World War I era, when prices plummet. And you see individual farmers, often through the encouragement of people like George Peake, who was president of the Moline Plow Works, trying to get farmers motivated to argue that we deserve parity prices. Our prices should never fall below the 1909 level. And out of that emerged more controversy, and the Farm Bureau tended to side with parity prices. The national government takes different approaches to maintaining prices, and so these kinds of conflicts emerge, and out of that comes new farm organizations.
Now, farm organizations do have a rich past here in Illinois, and I think you mentioned a little bit before that it's not necessarily an organization from the government, it's not an organization of the universities, sometimes church-based, sometimes need-based, as in a cooperative to market grain, to buy fuel or insurance. Give me the history between some of those.
Well, what I don't know the Champaign history specifically, but one of the earliest farm bureaus in the nation was in DeKalb County. And the farmers in that county, they wanted to hire their own farm expert, farm advisor. They also decided that they wanted to have, they needed access to fuel if they're going to invest in tractors. So then they therefore have to create their own gas station. They need to create their own hog marketing facility, for example. They wanted to improve their corn, so they invest farmers themselves into hybridization projects. And the farmers drove these projects that the Farm Bureau then took on. And that's DeKalb County, but I'm sure that Champaign County, well, I shouldn't say that. I don't know what Champaign County did, because you've got all different sorts of pressures here, because you're at the back door of the land grant.
Well, DeKalb, I think, was a model that other counties did follow, including Champaign County, as it developed its Farm Bureau and its relationship with the Extension Advisor. Who paid for these organizations? How did they get their funding?
Farmers paid
right.
for them.
Yeah, they basically funded it themselves, in other words,
Yeah.
to try to do a better job.
Yeah, investing in themselves.
Which is, I think that's kind of interesting, kind of an underlying theme for agriculture since day one, is you just trying to do a better job. Many people talk about how farmers complain about the weather, they complain about the seed quality, but the whole reason is they want to grow that perfect crop. And why is that?
Right. because that's what they do.
That's what they do. That's
their
where the
life.
paycheck comes
Yeah.
from. That's exactly right. Well, what is the history? Well, I'll tell you what we're going to do, let's take a short break, and when we come back, let's talk about some more of those farm groups and organizations and how they change politics, and we'll do that right after this short break here on Champaign County Agriculture Today.
In 1983, extreme heat and drought caused the yields of corn to drop to 89 bushels per acre from 147 bushels the year before.
Welcome back to Champaign County Agriculture Today as we discuss the very vibrant and interesting history of agriculture that, of course, someday, as we talk with Deborah Reed here from Eastern Illinois University and U of I, today will be history sometime in the future, I guess, right? As a history teacher, you embrace that, I understand.
Yes, I do.
Many organizations that were vying for the farmer's interest and trying to help out the farmer. When I hear the letters to AAA, I think of the AAA Auto Club, the American Automobile Association, but there was a different one?
There was a different one, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. It started in 1933. And to preface that just a little bit for background, there were the economic depression, 1929, severely undercut pricing of agricultural commodities. Consumers don't want to pay more than they want, so you begin to see about 29, 30, 31, 32 contests between consumers seeking low prices, farmers seeking higher prices, and farmers become radical. There's a farm holiday organization that emerges in Iowa. It includes Illinois farmers. To what degree Champaign farmers became involved, I don't know, because it was largely people that were in milkshed areas, and they're wanting better prices for their milk so they can keep food on their table. You also see the Corn Belt Liberty League emerging that didn't want any kind of national intervention. They wanted the market to drive prices. And then the national government, with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, changes approach. And instead of relying on private and individual volunteerism to improve the desperate economic times, they believe that the government can have a role. And out of that philosophy emerges the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. And for Illinois, it's the corn program and the hog program that was the most influential. People who were part of the extension movement, cooperating farmers, they were the ones that began to be involved as beneficiaries of the Agricultural Adjustment Administration payment programs.
Were they acting as agents of the federal government or just through the policy philosophy?
They sign up
Okay.
to participate in the programs that the policy creates. And they sign up usually through or at the behest of extension agents through the U of I Extension Office. Generally, the government believed that if you reduced production, your prices would go up. And to reduce production, you had to take desperate means sometimes, not just reducing acreage, but eliminating acreage.
How was that done?
Well, plowing under in some instances so
Actually
that you met
destroying
the
the
quota,
crop. Mm-hmm.
destroying the crop, destroying pigs. There was a ratio between the corn you produced and the pigs you could market. And if you were not within that ratio and you were a member of the program, then you jeopardized your payment.
Mm-hmm.
So those were some of the, some people would argue heavy-handed approaches, but that's what, at the time, the national government believed needed to be done, and there was a lot of buy-in to that. There was also a lot of resistance to it.
The farm programs of today, for those that aren't familiar, do usually have some type of economic incentive to pay farmers a little bit for that loss in production. What was the case back then?
Same sort of incentive. One of the things that emerges in terms of incentive is aerial photography. So, you take photographs of those fields that the farmers say that they're not producing. And those aerial photographs still form the basis of much of the crop allotments and the data that the folks in the county offices use to this very day.
Is there anyone that can tell us and look back at history and say that those programs worked and that we still need them today? I know that's kind of looking at policy speculation.
Yeah, and I would hazard to speculate on policy, but what I can tell you is there's an evolution of policy, and the AAA program, as it changed, because there was a second AAA in '35 and then another one in the early '40s, in an effort to, an ag policy regularly thereafter, that shifted away from production control to land stewardship and soil conservation. Mm-hmm. So that was the shift that has led us to the crop reduction programs that are very much part of ag policy today. Production controls remain controversial. What happens by the early 80s is that consumers have more and more influence. Well, it starts in the 60s, but by the 80s, consumers are the ones that are increasingly driving ag policy. And to maintain the balance between what the prices consumers pay for the foodstuffs with, what the farmers can reap. And because farmers are no longer feeding themselves, they might be feeding 175 other people, but they have to go to the grocery store to feed themselves just like everybody else. Farmers, have a mixed relationship or mixed attitude towards policy too.
How much does it deal with back years ago, back in the early 1900s, that farmers were a larger majority of the population in general, whereas today, what is it, 2% of the population?
Yeah.
So they can almost be considered a minority, and how does that affect policy?
Well, amazingly, that minority is incredibly influential in policy because that minority may produce, but look at the numbers of people that are engaged in agribusiness.
Yeah, that's true. So not only as farmers, just as a group, a small number but influential, but also then outside of that group are those that work in agriculture, and they all vote. Right. So that makes a big difference right there as well. Well, how do these farm organizations, how have they evolved over the years? What's made them different, what they do today and what they did when they first began?
Well, that's a good question. And it's a general question that I'd have to think about a little bit. The evolution of different groups, I guess. There's the Farm Bureau still alive and well and still appealing to certain groups of farmers. And I wouldn't categorize Farm Bureau members in any way.
So not all farm organizations have survived over the years?
No, definitely not. And others have emerged, like the Farmers Union, 20th century product. And things like the tractorcade during the 1970s, for example, was a public protest supported by farm organizations, but political crises, I guess, fuel organizations. Some survive, some don't. The most established ones, the Farm Bureau, the Farmers Union, have incredible political clout, have had that from the very beginning and maintained that by having opinions. And much of the time, I think the opinion tends to follow the Secretary of Agriculture. And of course, from the 50s, the Secretary of Agriculture message has been get bigger or get out, with Butts and Benson. And to the degree that a farm organization supports that, it'll have members who agree. And contrary or counter organizations will develop, and it'll survive because there will always be members that argue against get bigger, get better, and get out, or get out.
So Deborah, it sounds like that over the years history has changed, but turmoil and interest remains. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. We really appreciate it. And we thank you for listening today here on Champaign County Agriculture. Hope you'll tune in again next time. I'm Dennis Riggs.
Champaign County Agriculture Today is brought to you by Champaign County Farm Bureau.